Welcome to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society's March program. I'm Tim Stites, a longtime board member of the Historical Society, and my introduction is a little bit longer than usual just because we have several commercials to go over. And one is next month's program is April 10th, and at 7 o'clock at the Martin Perry House, and our own Sherry Carmichael. Where's Sherry? She was sitting right there. Oh, anyway, she's doing an Irina Carpenter's Diary, which is one of the founders of Powell and what's that? Liberty Township. Sorry, and I actually watched her program at Delaware County Historical Society. It was awesome. So, highly recommend that, and also recommend you to go onto our website to see past programs. We have Ron here, Foth, who did last month's program. So we can kind of hit both ends of the past and the future. Tonight, we were very fortunate to have with us Brad Lepper, renowned archaeologist, who will present Serpent Mounds, an icon of ancient Ohio. Linda, who has the task of filling up these programs, it's very tough, but she does a great job, heard about Brad from the Ohio Historical Connection, who referred us to the Ohio Humanities Council. And this is another commercial. The Ohio Humanities Council, state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, has provided leadership, resources, and financial support for the humanities in Ohio. Humanities programs take various forms such as books, discussions, public lectures, historical portrayals, touring exhibits, radio series, and forums. The council produces and supports programs in every region of the state. In urban and rural areas, humanities programs take place in libraries, museums, theaters, classrooms, senior centers, and other community locations. For more information, visit our website at ohiohumanities.org. That's all the commercials. So Brad is the curator of archaeology for the Ohio Historical Society and an occasional visiting professor of sociology and anthropology at Denison University. His primary areas of interest are North America's Ice Age peoples, Ohio's magnificent mounds and earthworks, and the history of archaeology. Noteworthy research includes evacuation of the Burning Tree Mastodon and discovery of the Great Hopewell, featured in a recent documentary. Some of you may have read his articles in the Dispatch, and I guess there was an article yesterday in the Dispatch, if anybody caught that, or the Echoes magazine, or perhaps have seen the PBS Columbus Neighborhood program featuring Brad and the Serpent Mounds. So looking forward to this presentation, and I turn it over to Brad.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for that nice introduction. I do want to correct something. My job title has changed. I think I need to go to the Ohio Humanities site and get that changed. I'm no longer a curator of archaeology. I'm now the senior archaeologist for the Ohio History Connections World Heritage Program. And that's a little bit relevant tonight because we're currently nominating the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks to the World Heritage List, but Serpent Mound is also on the United States Department of the Interior's tentative list of sites to be considered for future nominations for the World Heritage List. So after the program tonight, maybe you'll be in a position to understand why we want this to be on the World Heritage List as well. So thank you to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society for inviting me to be here tonight. And I thank the Ohio Humanities Speakers Bureau for sponsoring the program tonight. So yeah, we're talking about Serpent Mound, and Serpent Mound is probably like the world's most famous Indian mound. It's featured on the covers of books. Down there in the lower left is some art on the underpass of the Cook Road, underpass for the railroad. It's featured on the cover of the book I wrote, Ohio Archaeology. It's like the Ohio's official poster child for mounds. This is a poster produced by the Ohio Archaeological Council for Ohio Archaeology Month in 2013, and there's Serpent Mound. So it's Ohio's most recognized ancient pre-contact icon, but oddly enough, there's still some debate about the age of Serpent Mound. Which of the many cultures that lived in Ohio in ancient times were responsible for building it. It used to be thought, well, actually, I'll get into this because I've been very active in this debate recently, and I'll sort of tell that story at the appropriate point here. So Serpent Mound is down in northern Adams County. Adams County is on the Ohio River, but this is as far away from as far away as you can get from the Ohio River and still be in Adams County. There you can see some of the contours of what it's looked like of the mound when you're standing at the site. And here's the beautiful aerial photograph taken by Timothy Black, who works with the Newark Earthworks Center. And it shows the earthwork on this sort of rocky peninsula that juts out into the valley of Ohio Brush Creek. And it's just, when you go down to the end of that, you can't really see Brush Creek from there, but it runs right along that bluff. And it's in the middle of what's called the Serpent Mound impact crater. It's a meteorite crater. And some people think maybe that's got something to do with it. Maybe the ancient American Indians recognized it as a meteor crater. I'm not so sure about that. The impact was almost 300 million years ago. So it's not really an obvious meteor crater like meteor crater in Arizona. But there is one aspect of the site that it owes to that meteorite impact, and that's that the bedrock got jumbled up, and it probably helped to create this rocky bluff on which the Serpent Mound is built. And this is a drawing done by Frederick Ward Putnam's team back in the 1880s. Putnam was the very first archaeologist. He was from Harvard University, the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and he was the first archaeologist to really study this extensively. And this is a photograph of it, and some people think, if you close one eye and squint, it looks actually like a serpent. And this is something that indigenous people all over the world do. They see landscape features that evoke some, in this case, a serpent, and then perhaps enhance it or add to it to make that sort of hidden serpent more explicit for people. And in this case, I think it's very probable that indigenous people imagined this to be a serpent emerging from the earth, some kind of serpent spirit, and then perhaps built Serpent Mound on the top of that bluff as a way to honor that serpent. In about 1900, there was a Reverend Landon West, who got it in his mind. He lived in Adams County, got it in his mind that Serpent Mound wasn't just any serpent. It was the serpent of the Garden of Eden, and had an apple in its mouth there. Now, that was a very popular interpretation at the time, and that he thought Adams County was Eden, and that this marked the site of Eden. And Adams County is certainly beautiful, but Eden? Maybe not. I think that's telling us what was going on in the Reverend West's mind, and not necessarily what was in the mind of the people that were building it. And it's one of the challenges of Serpent Mound. Unlike the Hopewell earthworks that are this geometry, or the hilltop enclosures, I mean, nobody tries to understand the circles and the octagons. They just appreciate them as these gigantic geometric shapes. But when it's a serpent with an oval at its head, it almost seems too familiar. And it's like, and you can interpret it in terms of what you think about serpents, but you really can't. What it meant to the people that built it, however long ago it was, is almost certainly different from what we think about when we think about serpents. And it certainly has nothing to do with the Garden of Eden. So the Eastern Woodland Indian cosmology, their beliefs about how the universe was structured, it's at least a 3-layered universe. And often it's more complicated than that, but we'll just say it's 3 layers. There's the middle world in which we live. And it's on top of sometimes a serpent, or not a serpent, sometimes a tortoise. Sometimes it's just floating in the water. And there's this watery beneath world that's below our world. And there are 2 leading chief spirits of that watery underworld. It's usually one, but it depends on what tribe you are. So I talk about 2 of them: the great horned serpent and the underwater panther. Those are these 2 spirit beings that live in the water, that live that watery underworld. And sometimes they come out into our world. And then the world above is the above world, the sky world. That's where the thunderbird spirits live. And the thunderbird spirits and the underworld spirits are bitter enemies. But both of those realms are sources of great spiritual power. And that may be one of the reasons Serpent Mound was built, and hopefully I'll remember to touch on this at the end, that it was a place where people could go and solicit power from the underworld. Here's actually a Delaware drawing of a Manitou, which is just another word for spirit, showing that these serpents, they weren't always just serpents. Sometimes, as you'll see, they have deer antlers. Sometimes they have birds' feet, and sometimes they have wings. They are really kind of serpent creatures. And it indicates that Serpent Mound, I think, represents that great serpent of the underworld. And so it's not just an effigy of any old snake wandering around. So you've seen this map already. This was actually it was published in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution with other maps of mounds from Ohio and other places. So it sort of situates Serpent Mound in this, not just in the history of Ohio archaeology or American archaeology, but the history of American science. This was done by Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, and it's wrong, it's incorrect, because it shows a serpent with this egg, perhaps in its mouth, and then the egg is right at the edge of the bluff. And that's the way most people think about Serpent Mound, because this was that early famous map, and it's an iconic image, and it's how Putnam thought about it. It's how many archaeologists still think about it, that this is a serpent with an egg in its mouth. For Squire and Davis, and then also for Frederick Putnam, it was because they liked that image or liked that interpretation, because in the Orient, there's, India, in Eastern civilizations, the serpent with an egg in its mouth is some kind of iconic image that I don't know much about that. And they thought that just indicated that people came from those regions and had that same kind of idea about serpents with eggs in their mouths. And it does look like that when you look at that picture. But John McLean in 1884, still before Putnam had restored the mound, was there, and he said it was a more complicated effigy. He actually thought there were two effigies. There's something on the other side of the oval. And his idea was that it was a frog. And okay, maybe, but his sort of story he told about it was so absurd that I think it made a lot of people simply reject it out of hand. Like, oh, he's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Because he said the frog was like on the cliff, and the serpent was striking at the frog, and the frog in her panic was leaping away and then squirting out an egg in her excitement. Except the egg is so big that the frog would fit in it. So, when I read that, I thought, this guy's imagining things. That's probably not there, because Squire and Davis didn't map it. But other archaeologists mapped it too. And I really didn't change my mind about that there until I did some of the research that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So first I want to introduce Serpent Mound sort of in chronological order, what we know about it. This is Frederick Ward Putnam. He was there between 1883 and 1889. Actually, it's not Putnam, it's an article. This is like the only paper, really, he published about Serpent Mound, and it was in the Century magazine. And this is a map from it, and it shows the serpent on its bluff, but it shows a bigger landscape as well. I think I've got this so that I can show these. So there's the serpent effigy. There's a relatively large conical burial mound, and I'll have some slides later to show you what was found in that mound, but it's what we would now call a mound of the Adena culture, an ancient American Indian civilization that lived here but like around 300 BC, 600 BC, somewhere in that range, perhaps all the way up to almost AD 1. That area, there's actually another small Adena mound in there, but you see all those little dots. That's actually a village site of the Fort Ancient culture. And the Fort Ancient culture lived about AD 1000 or so. And they had quite a large village. They had a wall around the village, a palisade wall, and they grew corn, beans, and squash. And it was a pretty big village with a number of houses. And that is another mound that's called the elliptical mound or the oblong mound. I'll have a slide for it. When that was excavated by Putnam, there were artifacts in there that relate to the Fort Ancient culture. So there's an Adena mound, or actually there's two Adena mounds, a Fort Ancient culture village. And actually, when Putnam excavated the Fort Ancient village, beneath that, sort of stratigraphically below it, he found traces of an Adena village as well, but it was much smaller. And actually, whether it was a village or some kind of special camp, like what's called a mortuary camp. So maybe it was just where the people camped while they were building the burial mound and while they were conducting the funeral ceremonies for the people buried in those mounds. So it might have been that kind of thing, a very small, limited occupation associated with the mounds. Or it may have been a small village. So you've got two different cultures represented on that landscape, Adena with mounds, Fort Ancient culture with mounds. Putnam assumed that the Serpent Mound was built by the earlier culture. And he didn't have those names, Fort Ancient and Adena. Those names hadn't been come up with yet by archaeologists. But he recognized that the Fort Ancient culture was almost like the contemporary American Indians that lived there in the early historic times. And he didn't have a very high opinion of them, apparently, because it's like, oh, these people were cruder than the earlier, more advanced civilization. And he said that a more advanced civilization must have been the one that built Serpent Mound. So he excavated the burial mounds, he excavated the village. He also conducted excavations into the Serpent itself, any artifacts in it. So that would have helped, because if he'd found artifacts, you could say, oh, the people that used these artifacts, maybe they match up with the people that built the burial mounds or the people that lived in the village. But he didn't find any artifacts, so there was no way to tie the mound directly to one of those cultures. But he did find in some places rocks at the bottom and gray clay right beneath it, and that's going to be important later, and yellow clay, stones, dark soil, and sod, and so on. So he defined the layers that compose the mound. So here's the large burial mound and drawings of the artifacts he found there. And these are artifacts that we would now recognize as Adena culture artifacts, around 300 BC. And here's that elliptical mound. These are artifacts we would now recognize as artifacts of the Fort Ancient culture that he found there around 1100 CE. The village, and these are actually artifacts from the village, but they're not from the Peabody collection. We excavated a water line 20 years ago to get water to the museum and found traces of the village still there. And so these are artifacts from the Ohio History Connections collections. These are those spear points of the Fort Ancient culture. These are artifacts of the Adena culture. So we're still finding evidence of those overlapping villages in excavations, more recent excavations. And again, the Fort Ancient culture is a much larger village, walls around it. They're growing corn, beans, and squash. The Adena culture, they lived in much smaller communities. They were doing a little bit of agriculture, but they were farming things like squash and sunflower and goosefoot. They weren't growing corn yet. And those communities tended to be not very sedentary. They would live in one place for a while and then move on to another place. So very different cultures. So yeah, Putnam, his conclusion, that's actually him now, was that everything relating to the construction of the Great Earthwork points to antiquity. The modern American Indians and their immediate ancestors didn't build it. It was this earlier culture. And there you still see it just shows the oval. So in 1991, I worked with a couple of amateurs that they were studying Serpent Mound and they wanted to figure out how old it was. And we said, well, one of the things Putnam talked about when he excavated the Serpent was in some places there was ashes mixed with clay. Now, Putnam didn't know anything about radiocarbon dating, but we did. And so with radiocarbon dating, if you can find sort of an ash layer at the bottom of the mound and date that will tell you exactly when the mound was built. So that's what we went looking for. And the way we decided to do it was we didn't want to just chop holes into the Serpent like Putnam had done. It's a national historic landmark. We wanted to do as little damage as possible. So we used soil cores, sort of a big metal hollow thing that we could extract tubes of soil. And what we were looking for was jumbled stratigraphy. So when you saw the different layers that Putnam found, if we put a tube in there and found evidence of those layers, it's like, okay, he didn't dig here. So we would move and then put the probe again and look up. And then if we found jumbled layers, it's okay, that's a trench that Putnam dug and he just filled in the dirt willy-nilly and it's all jumbled up. And this is a place where we did find that. And then we opened it up, very small trench, it was about as small as you could make, and worked it back until we found undisturbed layers of earth. And this is our drawing. This is the base of the mound here. These are the layers going up. And actually, when Putnam first saw the mound, he thought it was wonderful. He comes back later, and the people that owned it had started plowing the mound. So it had become damaged. And then that's when he went, oh my gosh, went back to Boston, raised a bunch of money, bought the mound, and turned it into a park. And then Harvard University owned it for a while. Harvard University eventually gives it to the Ohio History Connection to take care of. So when Putnam comes back, he tries to restore the mound. He excavates the edge all the way around it and then sort of scoops up the soil and puts it back on there. So about half of the mound now is restoration, but a good half of the mound is still that intact mound underneath. We didn't find an ash layer. So it's like, rats, what can we do? So we looked at the strata and we decided to do what's called flotation. We would go to the sort of the best preserved parts of the mounds and take a soil sample, take it back to the lab, put it in water, and then if there's any bits of charcoal in there, they'll float to the top and the heavy soil will go to the bottom. And this is something that paleo-ethnobotanists do in archaeology all the time. They look for seeds and all kinds of things. So we did that. We took soil samples from here and here. See, this dark lens was a rodent burrow, groundhog or something. So we didn't want to sample that because that would be jumbled up soil. It could come from anywhere. So we went to places where we knew the mound was intact. It was original mound, took those samples. And for both of those places where we took samples, we found charcoal. And we sent both of those pieces of charcoal, separated by quite a bit, to a radiocarbon dating lab, and both of them dated 1120 CE. And we thought at the time, this was in 1991, that established that it was the Fort Ancient culture and not the earlier culture that built the serpent. Well, around 2014, this other team of scholars, it's a whole list of men and women there that were involved in this, decided that, the guy that was leading the project thought it was built by the Adena culture. He said, no, it wasn't built by the Fort Ancient culture. That date's wrong. And so their strategy was to do a number of cores into the mound, sort of like we did, but I think their cores were bigger. But then look at those cores and find the base of the mound and take those soil samples, which sometimes had charcoal in them, but most of the time, maybe not. And they took those soil samples and sent those for radiocarbon dating. And they got a whole series of dates that go from between 300 to 600 BC. And they said, see, this shows the mound was actually built by the Adena culture, not the Fort Ancient culture. And they said, where you got those dates for the Fort Ancient culture, that's a place, that's kind of a low point in the mound, and the mound must have washed away, and maybe the Fort Ancient people rebuilt that section. That was their idea. And I was like, well, I mean, this is how science works. You know, new scholars do results, and as a archaeologist, since I'm not committed to the idea that the Fort Ancient culture built it, it's possible the Adena built it. It's possible the Adena built it and the Fort Ancient rebuilt it. But I need to see good evidence to support that. I think the evidence that we got, that charcoal from the intact mound dated to the 1100, was pretty good evidence. And there are problems with dating soil. And there are problems with sort of using a soil core to figure out what's going on with the stratigraphy. I've done it many times, and it's complicated, and it's hard to be certain that you've actually found that contact between the base of the mound and the mound fill. So yes, I have these questions for you. Which of the dates are most accurate? This column is Fisher et al., which Fisher and others, and I'm one of those others, and this is the new group. And with radiocarbon dating, there's really two things you want to really be sure about. One of them is the context. Can you be sure of the context? And I think I've outlined that the Fletcher et al. Has really good context. We knew exactly, we could see the whole profile. We could see where the groundhog burrows were to avoid. We took that soil out, and that's where we got our charcoal. The Herman et al. Group, their contexts were a bunch of soil cores, which, maybe they actually identified the base of the mound, but maybe not. They certainly couldn't look to see if they were in a groundhog burrow or not. They didn't have the profile exposed. So it's just, they can't really be sure 100% about what they're dating and where. And then the second part of this, are the samples they're dating going to produce reliable results? So radiocarbon dating, we know a lot better how it works now. And if you've got like a seed, that's like the ideal thing to date. And probably even better if it's charred, because then you know it's ancient. And a charred seed means you're dating the life of that plant, to a specific point in time. And it can get you the most accurate and precise age. If you're dating a chunk of wood, that's what Fletcher et al.'s team has, it's not that precise. And why not? Why would you, if I just had a tiny chunk of wood from somebody's wood fire, why would you not be able to say that was exactly dates to 1 year? No thoughts?
Trees live a long time.
Yeah, trees live a long time. Like if it's a huge tree, it could be 500 years old. And if you throw that in a fire, if you get the charcoal from the outer layer, it will be pretty accurate. But if it burns down to like the berry inside, you could be 500 years off in your date. So you still can't really get a precise date if you're just dating a chunk of wood charcoal. So I say yes because it's wood charcoal and I at least know that it's going to be plus or minus, or no, not plus or minus, that wood charcoal, the date we got for that is going to be a minimum date. The mound will be at least that old and maybe a little bit older, maybe a century or two older, it's possible. So it gives you some reliability about the age. But Herman et al. Were dating what's called soil humates. And soil humates, we know they're not reliable. They often give dates that are much older than the actual age. And this was really demonstrated in a recent study in Norway, Denmark, somewhere. It was published in the Norwegian Archaeological Review. And it was a team that was dating burial mounds in that country. And they were trying to date when Christianity entered the region. So they were dating these mounds, and sometimes they excavated mounds and found, we know this mound is a mound of Christian burials, or this mound is pagan burials, and then they would date those. And then they went to other mounds and did soil cores. And they were concerned with, when they were listing their dates, okay, we know these are Christian and these are pagan, but these ones we just dated the soil cores from, the dates seemed off to them. They seemed too old. And so to test that hypothesis, they went to the mounds that they had already dated. They knew this was a Christian mound, and they knew this was a pagan mound, and put soil cores in them and dated those, and the dates came back way too old for each of those mounds. So part of that is you can't control the context when you're just doing a soil core, and part of it is if you're dating soil humates, basically what that means is it's organic acids in the soil, and they could be almost any age. And these guys, this Norwegian Archaeological Review team was saying that the soil acids can stay in the soil for a long, long time. And so if you sample that, what you're dating is that soil horizon. You're not dating the event that you want to date. And so they redated those mounds and got proper dates for them. So, if we know Serpent Mound was built by ancient indigenous American Indians, why do we care if it was built 1,000 years ago or it was built 2,000 years ago? Because history. It's a story, this American Indians aren't just sort of one homogeneous culture. Over 16,000 years, archaeologists have defined various cultures: the Paleo-Indians, the Archaic peoples, the early woodland people, the middle woodland people, the late woodland people, the Forward Ancient culture. And they've changed over time, and sometimes those changes are important. And if this serpent was built by the Adena culture, it would mean something probably very different than if it was built by the Forward Ancient culture or the Paleo-Indian culture. So we want to situate it in time to understand what it probably meant for the people that built it. So if radiocarbon dating is not working out, I mean, if people can say, okay, you got that wood date, but maybe it's older than you think, or who knows where that wood came from. Maybe there's problems with that date. And you've got these soil humates dates that aren't really that reliable. What else could you do? I mean, if it was your job, figure out who built Serpent Mound, and you can't use radiocarbon dating because everybody disagrees apparently with the results. What would you do? What other ways could you use? I mean, thinking in terms of Ohio's story, right? These different cultures. How could you figure out which of those cultures built the mound? Any thoughts? So you've got an effigy mound, a mound built in the shape of an animal. We've only got 2 of those in Ohio. One of them's got a date for it. Serpent Mound's got many dates for it that disagree. Also, there are lots of effigy mounds in the upper Midwest. So one way is like, well, who else is building effigy mounds? Did the Adena culture build any effigy mounds? Did the Forward Ancient culture build any effigy mounds? Plus, one thing you can say about the people that built Serpent Mound: they thought serpents were wonderful, were amazing. It was like the most important thing because they built this giant serpent. So what other cultures in that long story of Ohio's indigenous cultures, which other cultures thought serpents were the best thing ever? Was it the Adena? Or was it the Forward Ancient culture? Because that would fit, right? I mean, I think it would. So are there any Adena serpents? And possibly one. The Adena effigy pipe. It's Ohio's official state artifact. It's a man, and he's wearing a loincloth, and there's a kind of a serpentine pattern on the loincloth. Maybe. It's not obviously a serpent, but I think it probably is. That's the only artistic motif I've ever seen from the Adena culture that says anything that has a serpent on it. This is that other team. Instead of being Herman, Bill Romaine was the first author on this. And Bill Romaine is the guy that really thinks that Serpent Mound is Adena. And he thinks it should be Hopewell, but he's happy that he got these early Adena dates. They actually said this in a scholarly article. There are many reasons why people or creatures may or may not be represented in prehistoric imagery. We do not find images of the Buddha, Mohammed, or Jesus made during their lifetimes. But that does not mean that those individuals were not important. Okay, so maybe the culture that built Serpent Mound had some kind of religious prescription of making serpent effigies. But they built that. So they probably didn't have a religious prescription against making ones because they built the largest graven image of a serpent in the world. What about the Forward Ancient culture? Tons of serpents. They have these copper serpent effigies that actually look quite a lot like Serpent Mound. They have these intertwined, probably serpents. Most archaeologists interpret those as serpentine patterns on the pottery. This is a slate tablet, and you probably have a hard time seeing it, but it's engraved with one of these serpent monsters. It's kind of like half serpent, half fish, but the jaws are almost like the jaws of a cat. And it really relates to a broader pattern we see during this Mississippian period. So the Forward Ancient culture is in Ohio. It's called the late pre-contact period. But at the same time in the Mississippi Valley and in the southeast, it's called the Mississippian period, because the center of sort of indigenous civilization has shifted from the Hopewell of the Ohio Valley of 2,000 to Cahokia outside of St. Louis and Etowah in Georgia, these large cities with big platform mounds with temples on top, or the houses of chiefs on top. And there are thousands of people live in these cities, at least Cahokia. And yeah, there's a lot of serpent motifs show up in the Mississippian culture. So here's petroglyphs from Ohio of serpents made by the Fort Ancient culture. Here's a sandstone tablet from the Mississippian culture showing these two intertwined serpents with jaws and teeth that look like they're cats or some kind of mammalian carnivore with canine teeth that intermesh. And Susan Power, who wrote a book about Mississippian imagery, says that Mississippian symbols, iconography, featured especially, here's the quote, new serpentine expressions, often distinguished by their unique size, placement, elaboration, and at times function. So the Mississippian culture, the Fort Ancient culture, thought serpents were like the best thing ever. This is a pictograph, a set of pictographs from a cave in Missouri. And this is when my whole sort of new phase of research kicked in. This is from Picture Cave. This was a book authored, edited by Carol Diaz Granados and James Duncan. And they have this beautiful color book on Picture Cave that has all the pictographs. And they think this cave is telling the creation myth of the Degiasuan people. Those are 5 tribes that lived originally in the Ohio Valley and then later moved out on the plains. And it includes the Quapaw, the Osage, the Omaha, and I never remember all of them. But I looked at that and I went, that looks familiar. So if you take those 3 motifs, according to Carol and Jim, and they work closely with the Osage in particular, that this shows a key moment, a key episode in what's called in a Degiasuan creation story. And it's the key moment when the great serpent mates with first woman. And from that sexual encounter, first woman acquires the great serpent's power of regeneration, which she uses to create all life on earth. And here I've rearranged that imagery to show the serpent, the oval, and the woman with splayed legs. And the oval in Picture Cave, they interpret it either as the open mouth of the serpent or as the opening to the womb of first woman. And I was really fortunate because within a month of me reading the book, Carol and Jim came to Denison University in Granville to give a talk. And I teach sometimes at Denison. And I showed up for that talk and I had my picture of McLean's map. And afterwards I went, excuse me, can I talk? And I showed them that picture and they were like, I've never seen that map of Serpent. And I says, no, it was done by McLean, but it was done early too. And I think the other guys were just biased. So they left off the frog because they didn't really think it was there apparently. And they agreed with me that it's telling the same story as those pictographs at Picture Cave. And it seems to make sense that if you're going to build this gigantic serpent mound, why not represent this key moment in their Genesis story? Also, Serpent Mound has these bulges on its neck. And some people have said those are the wings of the feathered serpent. Well, they're pretty tiny wings. And some people have said they're the horns of the horned serpent. So, well, they don't look a lot like horns. This is another image in Picture Cave of the great serpent. And he's got antlers, which you can probably barely see. But he also has these bulges on the side of his head, which the Picture Cave folks say those are the ear spools that the great serpent was wearing, like the ear spools on the Adena pipe, for example. And so it makes sense to think that those bulges on Serpent Mound's neck are actually ear spools and are actually further corroboration that this is the same imagery. So the paper I'm working on now with Carol and Jim and John Soderberg from Denison is looking at Ohio rock art and comparing it to picture cave, and Serpent Mound. And this is from Leo petroglyph, and there's a serpent and sort of a U-shaped symbol, and this probably the head of the great serpent. That's that picture cave image down in the lower left-hand corner with the antlers. This is an image of a petroglyph from Missouri, Serpent Mound. These all, we think, are telling the same widespread story about the creation of all life on our planet. So the other question you can ask, like who thought serpents were the best thing, is who else is building effigy mounds? The Adena aren't known to have built any other effigy mounds. The Forward Ancient culture built at least two. There's the Alligator Mound in Licking County, which I, with the team, excavated a trench into its left armpit, got charcoal embedded in the floor of the mound, which we dated, that dated to about the same time period, about 1100. The Kern serpent effigy was excavated by archaeologist John White from Youngstown State University. They got radiocarbon dates that also dated to the Forward Ancient culture, and there's actually two of those. They're not as serpentine as Serpent Mound, but they've got these limestone slabs that seem to show the rattlesnake's tail. Also, there's like thousands of effigy mounds in southern Wisconsin and neighboring parts of Iowa and Illinois. And they actually named the culture the effigy mound culture. And they have bears and birds and underwater panthers and all kinds of things. And shortly after, Carol, Jim and I, and Denison archaeologist or Denison geologist published our paper saying we think the picture cave pictographs are telling the same story as Serpent Mound. A guy named Ernie Bojart from Wisconsin said, I got something I want to show you. Oh, no, we'll do this first. So if Serpent Mound was built by the Adena culture, then it was built way back here. Here's the Forward Ancient culture, Late Woodland culture's Hopewell culture. This is the dates that my team got for Serpent Mound. This is the dates we got for Alligator Mound. These are all the dates for the effigy mound culture. So if you think Serpent Mound was Adena, somebody like 1,000 years, 1,500 years earlier built the best effigy mound ever, and then nobody ever built another one for another 1,000 years, and then they started building thousands of them. To me, it makes much more sense to have Serpent Mound fit into this broad cultural pattern of people building effigy mounds, of thinking snakes are the most wonderful things in the world. It seems parsimonious. It seems like the simplest explanation, even almost without radiocarbon dates. So yeah, here's what Ernie Bojart showed us. This is the Willow Drive effigy mound group in Wisconsin. And it's got a serpentine, but more sort of like morphing between an underwater panther and a serpent mound, connected to a figure that's kind of a horseshoe shape and a oval mound at the top of it, or a round mound in front of it. This one also has a bird to it, but there's also a bird in the picture cave panel too. So we think this shows at least a related story to the same story that's being told at Serpent Mound and the story that's being told on Picture Cave. And it dates to that effigy mound culture period. So yeah, there are all three of these: the Willow Drive Mound Group in Wisconsin, Picture Cave in Missouri, and the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. And we think these are all telling either the same or versions of the same making of the earth right, the first woman acquiring those powers which allow her then to become the creator. Now, I got a slide for this? We're not necessarily saying that the Degea-Siouan people built Serpent Mound, because the Degea-Siouan people have traditions that say they lived in Ohio, but it could just be that the Degea-Siouans, particularly the Osage, have the best preserved oral traditions. There's suggestions, for example, in Shawnee beliefs, their creator was a woman, and that's very unusual. Also, they have a snake clan, and I think they're the only Algonquian tribe that has a snake clan. There are other tribes like the Wyandot that also have snake clans. So it seems like because of those, Venn diagrams that all overlap, that this may have been a much more widespread tradition 1,000 years ago. But over time, and particularly with the devastation of European colonization and European diseases that swept through, and then the forcible relocation of peoples out of their lands, could have all disrupted many of those oral traditions in many tribes. And it may just be that we've got a fragment preserved by the Osage that was really much part of a much bigger tapestry that was a more widespread set of beliefs. So it matches, I think, what has been preserved by the Degea Siouan people, but I don't think it necessarily means the Degea and Sioux built Serpent Mound or these other things in Wisconsin or Missouri. Although Picture Cave probably was built by the ancestors of the Degea Siouan, because that's really their heartland, I guess. So this is my interpretation, or the interpretation of the group of scholars that I'm working with, is that Serpent Mound represents a cultural fusion of ideas from the effigy mound culture, of their ideas of like telling sacred stories using effigy mounds, the Mississippian art styles that emphasize serpents and that also include telling these sacred stories on the walls of caves with pictographs and petroglyphs. And then all that comes into the Fort Ancient culture, and they use their own traditions and the serpent iconography from the Mississippians and the effigy mound tableau from Wisconsin to create their own unique fusion that is the largest and I think, from my perspective, which is biased, this really elegant design. And I think that's the history of where this comes from. Now, this is a British comedian named Robin Ince. He works with Brian Cox, a physicist, on the Infinite Monkey Cage. And I think this is wonderful. Science is not about this is right. It's about saying this is definitely the least wrong version of events we have for the time being. And that's all I'm saying. I can't prove yet with absolute dates like radiocarbonates, because to do that we would have to do several trenches and find ash in the bottom of it and get those more precise dates. And maybe someday with cooperation and enthusiasm from indigenous tribes we can do that. But for right now, I think this is definitely the least wrong version of events we have for now. And this will be my last slide, I think, but this is Ben Barnes, chief of the Shawnee tribe. There's actually 3 Shawnee tribes, and they have sort of become much more involved with our interpretation at Serpent Mound. At the last 2 summer solstice programs, they've brought representatives, and this is actually Chief Barnes speaking at one of those. And this is actually a quote from Chief Barnes that we have on a sign at Serpent Mound. And I think it sums up it perfectly. He says, Serpent Mound was purposely built for a special sacred purpose. I should think that anyone that views the serpent will realize its sacredness and treat this place as they would any cathedral, synagogue, or mosque. When we see this place, this is our holy ground. And that's especially poignant given a lot of the craziness that's been taking place at Serpent Mound over the years, that people taking crystal skulls to the serpent or going down there and vandalizing the serpent to put organites, which are, I don't even know what they're supposed to be, but they're like realigning the energy fields at Serpent Mound by burying these things that they've made in the serpent, vandalizing the mound. I mean, these things desecrate the sites there. So, yeah, I mean, what can I add to what Chief Barnes said? So I do have a couple of things for further reading that will show up. These are both open access articles. These are both in the Ohio Journal of Archaeology, which is you can go to from the Ohio Archaeological Council's webpage. This is an article in the Mississippian Iconography of Serpent Mound. Talks a lot about what I already talked about. Why bulk sediment dates on Serpent Mound are problematic. That describes in detail that Norwegian Archaeological Review article that shows why dating soil cores and dating soil humates and not charcoal is a bad way to try to date anything. They may be accurate dates, but they're probably not, and they may be skewed wildly in many directions at the same time. So, any questions? I still have questions, but let me see what questions you guys might have.
So can you still see the frog shape anywhere?
Putnam, and this was something else that was brought up in terms of ridiculous objections to this interpretation, is Bill Romaine actually used LIDAR, which is like brand new technology we're using to use lasers to shoot down from the sky to do really fine examinations of relief. And he says, look at this in LIDAR analysis. It doesn't show any frog up there now. It's like, well, yes, I agree with that 100%. But Frederick Putnam did not believe it was there. So when he did his restorations of it, he didn't restore it. It had been plowed. Also, see, it has asphalt trails. Putnam installed those. Those run over what would have been the legs of First Woman. So, of course, it's not there now. I mean, there actually is a little triangular wedge of soil there at the end of the trail, which you can see that preserves part of the body. So there's that. But yeah, the horseshoe mound is almost entirely gone. But it's not because it wasn't ever there. It's because Putnam erased it intentionally because it didn't fit his hypothesis, his notion that there was a serpent with an egg in its mouth. Because if that was the case, what is that other thing going on the other side of the egg? That doesn't make sense. Let's get rid of that. But I don't think he did it intentionally like that. I think he was just convinced of his interpretation and so just neglected it to death, maybe. Because it was just, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's nothing. Yeah.
Do you find it unusual that over all those years, the roots of trees have not destroyed and gone into and destroyed some of the work?
Well, of course, this was covered with trees when Europeans first got here. And when the guy started plowing it, it was because a tornado had swept across it and tore the trees up, knocked them all down. Normally, trees are a good way to stabilize an earthwork. But yeah, if they die and sort of are blown over, usually the roots will pull up a bunch of soil. And undoubtedly that happened in at least a couple places on that. But based on our excavations, it's pretty intact. So, but yeah, and I think especially the older it is, the more likely it is to have had trees rip it up in sections. But if it's only 1,000 years old, it will have suffered less than if it's 2,000. But even the Hopewell and Adena earthworks that we know about are still pretty intact, even though they've also had centuries of trees growing on them. So yeah, it maybe not as much damage as you might think it would have caused. Yeah.
Now, it's read maybe a couple dozen articles about lunar, solar, celestial alignments of the Serpent Mound, but I don't know if any of that's true.
Well, it's interesting, and I didn't say anything about it. I probably should have. I suppose I can do it with this, because there is, I think, a legit alignment to the head. If you stand at the neck, where the neck comes together, and sight across the center of the oval, which used to have a platform of rocks there that the first archaeologist said it had evidence of burning on it. I mean, I think it was literally an altar on which offerings were burned to the Great Serpent. But by the time Putnam got there, I think even when Squire and Davis were there in the 1800s, or the earlier 1800s, they said that the rocks had been thrown down, like somebody had looked for treasure in it. And so the rocks were just scattered around. Eventually, they were just removed entirely. But there used to be a sort of a stone mound of rocks there in the center, an altar. So if you sight from the neck across that altar, you were looking at where the sun sets on the summer solstice. And so some people think the coils, they think like this coil is lined up to the summer solstice sunrise, and that coil is lined up to the equinox, and the other coil is lined up to the winter solstice sunrise. But then somebody else came along and said, no, it's lined up to the moon. This coil is lined up to the northernmost rise of the moon, this one's lined up to the midpoint in the cycle, and this one's lined up to the southernmost rise of the moon. And one guy I was talking to who believes all this, I said, well, it can't be both. Because if it's aligned to one, it's not aligned to the other. And he's like, no, they were just so smart, they could align it to both. I'm like, no, that's not how this works. The problem is the sight lines are too short, which means that if you stand like at one of those coils and look, if you're like 1 foot off from center or either way, you're going to change the alignment quite a lot. I mean, at the Newark earthworks, the circle and octagon is lined up to the lunar cycle, and those alignments are hundreds of feet long, and they're marked by gateways. You stand in, or they're marked by the wall. So you've almost got like this huge long rifle barrel, and you're standing at one end, and they're very precise and accurate alignments. There's so much fudge here in these that I don't think you can say. The Kern stone effigies that were down below Fort Ancient, I showed you one of those, and actually there's 2 of them. Those have solar alignments. Sunwatch Village in Dayton is a Fort Ancient culture village that's been reconstructed. It's almost like the colonial Williamsburg for ancient Ohio. And that village has this giant cedar post in the middle that turns the whole village into a sundial. And this puts on key dates. The shadow of that post goes in the chief's house or something. So the Fort Ancient culture, which was an agricultural culture, was very focused on the sun. So I think it's plausible and very likely, I think, that those coils do line up to the 2 solstices and the equinox. But it's not something I can prove. It's not something I can even argue strongly about, because somebody else can say, oh no, they're lined up to the moon. And it's like, all right, I suppose their alignments are just as good for the moon if you stand in the right place. So that's one of the reasons why I don't talk about the alignments, is because I can't be as sure. If we were talking about the Newark octagon, I'd be telling you all about the lunar cycle and how the lunar alignments are built into the architecture. And that's another thing that leads me to believe that yes, these ancient civilizations in America were focused on the sky, so they would have had those alignments into it. And there's already a winter or a summer solstice sunset alignment. It's really good. So it makes sense that the other solar alignments would be there. So I should talk about it. I should have included that. Next time I'll add a slide. Any other questions?
Are they still teaching this in the grade schools or middle schools?
Ohio history is mostly covered in 4th grade, but there's no questions about this stuff on the standardized tests. So it's not something that's really emphasized. I know in Newark, years ago, when I first started working there, they weren't bringing field trips there. This was back when schools actually had field trips. I mean, local Newark schools weren't coming to the Newark earthworks. And I actually got a meeting with the woman who was then in charge, what do they call it? The person that's in charge of the school, superintendent. And I was saying, oh, you need to bring field trips there. And she's like, yeah, everybody wants me to take field trips. And I was trying to tell her how important the Newark earthworks were. And then finally, we're getting ready to leave, and she was still like, yeah, you haven't convinced me. And my final argument was, ma'am, it's like this is Cairo, and you don't have the pyramids in the curriculum. And she went, oh. And for like 3 years afterwards, the Newark earthworks were a required field trip for 4th graders. And it was only when their budget, they completely ran out of a budget for field trips that they stopped that. But yeah, it's like, yeah. So yeah, if schools had more money, I'd be out there saying, yes, come on, bring field trips out here. All right, any other questions?
Earthworks in Newark, those are all Hopewell?
Yes, there's a possibility that there might be some of them early Adena things there too, and that the Hopewell just sort of elaborated it. But I think almost everything there is Hopewell, and that it was built as a coherent, single, intricate design. And I talk about it as a ceremonial machine, and all the parts work together.
And what was the age of that? That's
the age?
Yeah, the time frame that was built.
Yeah, the Hopewell civilization, as we call it, would have been from AD 1 to 400. And I think Newark is relatively late in there, but I've only got like 3 radiocarbon dates for the whole site. But they are in the like 300 AD range. But I think in some ways, and I know we're not supposed to be talking about Newark tonight, but it's got a circle and octagon and a circle connected to a square and a big oval where the burial mounds were. And I think all those elements are in Chillicothe. And I think Chillicothe is where it all starts. There's High Bank Works in Chillicothe that's a circle and octagon that's also lined up to the moon. There's a circle connected to a square that's called Hopeton Earthworks right across the river from Mound City. Mound City has a concentration of burial mounds, but it's a rounded square instead of an oval. But still, I think Mound City is kind of like the oval with the burial mounds. So I think somebody from Newark, some charismatic individual with a vision, they figured out all the astronomy and all the geometry in Chillicothe, and they came up to Newark near the Flint Ridge quarries. And Flint Ridge was the Hopewell's favorite flint, and then built this elaborate earthwork, I think, in a relatively short time, 30 years maybe, moving 7 million cubic feet of earth with pointed sticks and baskets. I'm sorry. You have to bring me back to talk about Newark some other time. Yes, another question.
These different groups of Indians, are they different generations of the same people?
Almost certainly. There is migration probably happened, but yes. And when people say, what happened to the Hopewell? I just turn around and say, well, what happened to those weird covered wagon people? Where did they go? Or those really strange Model T Ford people, what happened to them? Because that's essentially what archaeologists are talking about. When we say Hopewell, it only means people that lived between these dates and had mounds of a certain kind and used certain kinds of artifacts. So it's in the same way that some alien would come down and define a covered wagon culture and a Model T Ford culture and talk about the changes over time and a cell phone culture, Nintendo culture. It's just based on artifacts because we don't know their histories. We're making the histories up from all these little bits of things that we find in the ground, and there's their houses and their mounds and things. And we're just documenting when changes happened. And some of those changes might be because a new people moved in, but more likely than not, it's just that circumstances changed and people adapted to those new changes and started doing different things. Yes, in the back.
Early on, you said something about the gray clay was important, and you're going to mention it later.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot. But that's really key to the argument of the guys that are dating Serpent Mound, that's saying they're dating the A horizon underneath Serpent Mound. And that's like this, if you go out and dig a hole in the ground, soil scientists, will say there's all these different horizons. There's the A horizon, that's the organic layer. And then you get into the B horizon, which is like more clay. And then you get down into the deeper horizons. And the argument that the team that's dating the site to Adena, they're saying they sampled the dark A horizon, which would be the ground surface that the people that built Serpent Mound were walking on. And that, if they're dating the A horizon, it still has all these problems with the soil humates, but it would come closer. It's like, okay, that's what you would date. That would come closest, as opposed to the fact that when Putnam excavated it, he said there was no dark layer under the mound. And this is something that indigenous people, particularly Hopewell, would do. They would strip off the topsoil and build the mounds right on sort of the clayey subsoil, as it's like a firmer foundation or something, I suppose. Or maybe it was ceremonial, why they would do that. And Putnam said there was no A horizon. And when I tell them, it's like, you say you're dating the A horizon, but Putnam says there is no A horizon. It's like, oh, Putnam was wrong. It's like, okay. But here's a picture of Putnam's profile where he was excavating the side of the mound, and you can see the mound and it ends on this gray clay. It doesn't end in well, he was mistaking that for the gray E horizon. It's like, okay. We did other soil cores in the same place that they did soil cores, and we did not find an A horizon. I worked with a soil scientist from Todd Frolking, and he actually did chemical tests on the layers to demonstrate that it was not an A horizon. They didn't do any of those chemical tests either. So, thank you all for coming.